Destroying Media Narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is now time for, a little belatedly, time for the Tuesday night live stream. So thank you very much, everybody who's joined me. And well, it's been a kind of eventful day, to say the least. So let's get to it and comment on the first of all, there's the interesting development of Nigel Farage, who apparently will be stepping down and holding a by-election in Clacton, his constituency, in order to, it's not even clear in order to do what, but in order to clear his name. As you may know, though you may not know, it's not really that that, that these are not exactly events that everybody's following religiously. But as you may know, he has been accused of taking gifts and not declaring them in accordance with parliamentary custom. Now, to be honest, I don't really care very much about that, because there's an awful lot of gifting that's going on. And even Two-Tier Keir, who fortunately will not be around for much longer, but even Two-Tier Keir received an amazing number of gifts, including season tickets to his beloved Arsenal. I always love it when the media reported his beloved Arsenal. But he received season tickets for that, which they cost a pretty penny. He received that, but as long as you declare it, then apparently it's okay. No problem there. So, but the problem with Farage is that he failed to declare it, and now he feels hard pressed by the media and the political establishment to answer these queries. And so he decides that, well, I'm going to challenge the establishment, and I'm going to have a by-election. Now, there are some problems with that, because first of all, if there's a report about him which finds that he has violated the rules of Parliament, then he's going to have a by-election anyway. So he may be imposing on the voters of Clacton an unnecessary by-election that they may have to do another by-election in the not too distant future. Now, there's generally a rule in politics. I'd say it's a very important rule, namely that you don't force elections on people unnecessarily. If you don't have to have an election, then don't have an election. People don't really like elections. They're really very annoying, and they're really boring, and they get tired of people knocking on their doors and asking them how they intend to vote, and this goes on and on and on, and then they're tired of messages on television. So when you force an election on voters are likely to respond negatively. So, I mean, remember when Harold Wilson called an election in 1970, he didn't need to do it, but he thought he was doing quite well in the polls. So why not capitalize on his bump in the polls? Boom, he got punished and lost the election. And then, of course, the worst case was Edward Heath, who in February 1974 decided to call a general election in the middle of the miners' strike, thinking that he would receive some kind of a mandate from the British people, and that would presumably give him the power to do what exactly? Nobody really knew. He didn't know, and he got punished for that. He lost that election. And then, of course, there's another case with Theresa May, who unnecessarily called an election in 2017, and it turned out to be an absolute disaster for her. And a good that was the good result for Jeremy Corbyn. So, you really don't want to do those things. You want to leave elections to the latest possible date if there's any kind of a flexibility about this. So the problem with Farage is that, first of all, I mean, if this were a contested election, I think he may have, he may not do very well. I mean, if, even if he wins narrowly, then it would be seen to be a defeat because he had won that Clacton constituency quite comfortably in the 2024 election. But if, as seems to be the case here, he, nobody else is going to take part in this by-election. He'll just have this by-election, and nobody, neither Restore Britain, and nor the Conservatives, no Labour, no one stands in this election, then he'll get a meaningless win. He'll win. It'll be a meaningless because nobody had contested it, because they said, hey, this is a charade, a PR stunt. We're not going to take part in this election. And precisely because he might have to he might have to be forced by the parliamentary report to hold a by-election in the very near future. So he'll be inflicting two by-elections on his constituents. So it just will be kind of meaningless. Farage has always puzzled me. He's always been a somewhat enigmatic figure. It's never been clear to me that he was ever that interested in being prime minister. He's kind of stepped aside from politics, and he's come back to politics, and he stepped aside again, come back again. So it's always seemed as if his heart wasn't really in it, and you have to wonder whether this whole, I think it's a charade that he's going through now, is a way of bowing out from British politics. So here's a couple of reports about this today. We have the FT. It announces that he is he's quits as MP to force by-election. Then it says here that he's done nothing wrong. Farage said he was the most physically and verbally attacked public figure or a politician in modern times. So he has been attacked physically. There's no question. I mean, there were people threw drinks at him. So that is true. He has been attacked physically, but in this case, while the sums involved, as I say, they don't seem to be that excessive. The questions raised are reasonable ones. I mean, he got gifts. Why didn't he declare them? And he said the decision to trigger a by-election follows a bruising few weeks for the Reform UK leader, who has retreated from public view after revelations of a £5 million gift from Christopher Harborne, a Thailand-based cryptocurrency investor. So right away, as soon as you read somebody's Thailand-based, there's always something shady about anybody who resides in Thailand. You always have to ask, why are they in Thailand? What is it about Thailand that so entices people, particularly very rich people? I think the question answers itself. And then when you have cryptocurrency, that's always somewhat shady. But anyway, that's 5 million quid a gift. And then said Farage did not declare the gift, which was made before he was elected MP for Clacton in 2024. And he's facing a parliamentary standards investigation. And on Sunday, it emerged that Farage also received support in kind from his longtime aide, George Cottrell, ahead of the 2024 election, and he also failed to declare in his register. Farage accepted private security staff and accommodation from Cottrell, who was imprisoned in the US in 2017 after pleading guilty to wire fraud. And then here's the New York Times story, which says Mr. Farage argues that the gift was unconditional, that it was made before he won a seat in Parliament, and that there was no requirement to declare it. However, Daniel Greenberg, Parliament's Standards Commissioner, has opened an investigation into whether the money should have been made public under rules that require new lawmakers to declare some financial benefits received in the 12 months before their election. Okay, well, I guess I don't know, we'll have to see about that. If Mr. Greenberg finds that the gift from Mr. Harborne should have been declared, Mr. Farage might, under parliamentary rules, have been suspended from Parliament and forced to fight for a re-election in Clacton. But his announcement on Tuesday effectively preempts that scenario. It does not, however, block the investigation, which could be suspended pending the special election in Clacton and then resumed if Mr. Farage wins. That raised the possibility that the Reform UK leader could be forced in the second contest in Clacton later this year. So that's what I mean. This is likely, if nobody contests this election, then it's quite likely that his victory will be meaningless. He'll win, but just nothing. I mean, he won't have any kind of a contest, and particularly as there might be a competitive by-election down the road. So it's a strange action on his part, because he's not going to get any kind of vindication from this the by-election. But as I say, Farage is a somewhat strange figure, and I'm not at all convinced that he's ever been that interested in being prime minister, and that he may be just trying to wangle a way of getting out of it. Well, anyway, we'll see about that. Now, before I get on to NATO, which is my favorite subject, I want to talk about what's going on right now in Hungary. So, as you know, we have this new regime, and it's really very imposing a tyranny in very short period of time. So they've only been in power now essentially less than a couple of months, but they really mean business. They really mean to remove all opposition to the government in very, very speedily. So, as I think I've mentioned before, they're moving towards a constitutional amendment to remove the current president, Tomáš Šujuk. Now, Šujuk hasn't really done anything wrong. He's the constitutionally elected president of Hungary. I mean, it's more or less a ceremonial figure. Hungary is, like the UK. It's a parliamentary democracy. So the power is within the government inside the legislature, and the president, the head of state, nominally is just really essentially a rubber stamp. Um, but for some reason, Magyar is absolutely determined to get this person out, who's really not a very political person. He was the former president of the Hungarian Constitutional Court, but nonetheless, the media, and the media are playing a major role here. The media insists that he's somehow an Orban creature, but he was a president of the Constitutional Court, and he was elected by the National Assembly, as is required by the Hungarian Constitution. But nonetheless, this new amendment that Magyar is moving towards, and it's obviously going to be passed very shortly, specifically targets the current president, so remove him from office. Which is, well, that is a new one, because you can create a new position of president and then hold elections for president. Um, but you can't just simply adopt an amendment specifically targeting one person. I mean, we know this is elementary constitutional law that bills of attainder are illegal and unconstitutional. You can't have a law that specifically targets one person. A law has to target everybody. But nonetheless, they've done this just as Magyar adopted a constitutional amendment that prohibits any prime minister from holding office for more than 2 terms. That was obviously targeting Viktor Orban, who's, of course, held office now for 5 terms. Now, as I said before, I'm not exactly thrilled by term limits, because ultimately I think it should be up to voters to decide who should be in office, and there should be no arbitrary cutoffs and say, well, you can only have 2 terms. But even if you have term limits on executive positions, in order to prevent executives from amassing too much power, it doesn't really make much sense to have term limits for legislatures, because the way you form governments depends on whether a particular political leader is someone who can put together coalitions. This person is popular, he's liked across the aisle, he can put together a coalition comprising different parties. So therefore, he's the only person who can be prime minister, because he's the only person who can command a majority in parliament. I mean, those are the rules of parliamentary democracy. So it's completely goes against the principles of parliamentary democracy to impose this kind of a term limit, to restrict the person that voters and elected representatives actually want to head up a government. So it made very little sense, other than to prevent Viktor Orban from returning to power. But even then, it's very problematic, because it was always a way of targeting this one person. If you're going to impose term limits, as I say, that's very dubious. But if you are going to impose term limits, then it should be going forward. In other words, the term limits starting as of the next election. In other words, starting from the next election, then whoever has served 2 terms cannot serve a 3rd term. You can't make it retroactive. That's a fundamental principle of law, the constitutional. You can't make things retroactive. It has to be only going forward. So he's done that. But he's changed that. He's also said that legislators can only serve 3 terms. So prime minister can only serve 2 terms, which is 8 years, and then legislators can only serve 3 terms, which is 12 years. So that's also going forward, and of course that will primarily affect Fidesz, the opposition, because because it's also retroactive, and so therefore, after come the next election, they're not going to be they won't be eligible to run for re-election. So again, it's obviously directed at his opposition. But now, what Magyar has done, he first of all announced that the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, this is this educational institution set up by Fidesz, well, it's going to be no more. Bam, bam, it's going to close down. And that's it. So it was, I mean, was it a great educational institution? Well, it wasn't particularly, but nonetheless, it served a particular purpose in inculcating certain nationalist, patriotic ideas, a certain appreciation of Hungarian culture, and many students went through it, and it was part of the Orban government's attempts to challenge the kind of liberal hegemony over higher education. Since basically higher education is completely dominated by liberals, as much in Hungary, well, maybe a little less, but nonetheless, primarily in Hungary. But certainly, liberals dominate higher education throughout Europe, and of course throughout the United States. And so the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, MCC, was a way of trying to challenge that, a way of challenging the liberal hegemony. Now, I think that is a very worthwhile endeavor, because that it's a very big deal. So universities are, of course, very, very powerful institutions. Obviously, since that young people go there, and young people are inculcating with those ideas, and that's where you make your connections. That's where you know which side your bread is buttered, whom to suck up to, and so on. And there also they have an intimate connection with the institutions of society, and so on. I mean, that's how it works, of course, in the United States, where there's a very cozy relationship between the elite universities and the foundations and the think tanks, and then, of course, the elite law firms, and to a large extent Wall Street, and all, essentially all of the important elements in society. So it was always important to challenge that hegemony, and of course TISA, during the election campaign, promised that they would absolutely crack down on these alternative institutions that Viktor Orban had created, and precisely to challenge the first of all the intellectual orthodoxy, but above all the huge institutional infrastructure created by Brussels, created by all of the foundations, Soros, but of course it's all of the so many other foundations, which work hand in glove with Brussels, and they provide seed money, and then Brussels provide them with money. I mean, it's a very, very cozy web of interactions. And of course, the universities are part of that. The universities get a lot of their money from that. So this was the reason why Orban set out to challenge the liberal hegemony. And of course, say that when you attack powerful institutions are going to hit you back. And of course, they did that through withholding funds from Hungary. And the withholding of funds to a small country like Hungary, had an effect withholding, the Erasmus exchange program. That had a huge effect. Young people weren't able to, study in other universities in Europe, which was obviously going to upset young people. And so this was part of the Brussels blackmail effort, which is, hey, you want to enjoy money, you want to enjoy the Erasmus exchange program, you need to play ball with us. And this kind of blackmail, and that often works. It's just, but anyway. So Madar said he was going to do it. He was going to close down MCC, and he has in fact done so. He's issued an ultimatum saying basically MCC is coming to an end at the end of this month. July the 31st is the last day. Now, what is striking, and in a way, those of us who remember the collapse of Serbia, not with a bang, but with a whimper, following the overthrow of Milosevic in 2000, knew that somehow Hungary wasn't going to put up much of a fight. And they've announced this, that MCC is going, and there are no huge demonstrations out on the streets. Maybe there will be, but there have been no demonstrations. Now, if you recall, this is very important. If you recall, and we've done I've done a number of live streams on this. Remember the hysteria. This went on for years and years and years. The hysteria about the Central European University that was based in Budapest. Now, whenever the media write about the Central European University, they invariably put, esteemed, it's renowned, it's prestigious. You always have to shove in that adjective in order to persuade readers that Orban was going after some, very distinguished academic organization. Well, that's where Albert Einstein studied, and there was Sigmund Freud. That's where he did his PhD. This is complete rubbish. It was set up by George Soros, and it was done with a view to creating a cadre of liberals to take over Hungary and every other East European country. That was the whole purpose. Not in order to provide an education, but in order to provide a cadre to take over in Hungary. And so Orban actually said, "Well, we don't really want this. What do we want this for here?" Which is, since they're doing it in order to create a whole institutional infrastructure to ensure a permanent rule by liberals. Now, the way Orban got around that was he said, well, there's a real problem here with the Central European University. Namely, it's claiming to be an accredited American university and an accredited Hungarian university. So, in fact, when you get a degree from the Central European University, you're effectively getting two degrees. You're getting a degree from an American university, and you're getting a degree from a Hungarian university. So he said, well, that makes it very unfair. You're providing a very, this is obviously putting the Central European University at a huge advantage to Hungarian universities, who only provide a Hungarian university degree. So the Orban government said to the Central European University, well, if you're offering American degree, show us that you have a campus, an American campus. And then, of course, they started lying through their teeth. They started, trying to do all kinds of deceitful practices of trying to prove to the Hungarian government that they did indeed have an American campus. They didn't have an American campus. What they got at Bard University was essentially a kind of an administrative office. First of all, they just simply had a post office box. Then they had an administrative office, but it wasn't a campus. An administrative office is not a campus. And so what the Hungarian government told the Central European universities said, fine, you can stay, but you can't offer American university degrees. You can offer Hungarian university degrees, that's fine, but you can't offer American university degrees. So once that happens, once they were no longer offering American university degrees, then student enrollment numbers fell sharply, and then they decided to move out to Vienna. So that was that. But it's still there. He never closed down the Central European University. It's still there in a very, very nice location, NATO, Rutte, very close to the river, and so it's still in good hands, despite all the moaning and whining in the media. But nonetheless, this protest went on and on and on for years and years. I don't know how many articles the New York Times and the New Yorker and everybody else wrote about this horror that's being inflicted, this cultural barbarism, this appalling, savage attack on intellectual and cultural norms inflicted by the Orban government against this center of learning, the Central European University. So that was that. Now, another thing was, of course, the protests, not as well publicized, but nonetheless they had an impact, a large impact outside of Hungary. These were the protests against the Budapest University of Theatre and Film Arts. Now, what had happened there is that the Hungarian government said, well, this is an educational institution. I mean, it's a university. It's promoting the theater and film arts. We think it should promote Hungarian theater and film arts. It should promote Hungarian culture. This, of course, led to a whole sort of moaning and groaning and, oh, no, how horror, this is Philistinism, this is an attack on intellectual freedom, it's an attack on culture, and so on. However, if you are receiving money from the government, in other words, taxpayer money, then I don't quite see what is wrong with the Hungarian government saying, I think you should promote Hungarian culture. That you can have Pinter, you can have Brecht, you can have whoever you like, Tom Stoppard, whatever it takes your fancy. But that's all being done elsewhere in other countries. If you are going to enjoy money from the Hungarian taxpayer, then I think you should promote Hungarian writers, Hungarian dramatists, Hungarian film, and so that otherwise, why have something called the Budapest University of Theatre and Film Arts? Anyway, there was a huge amount of protest about this. There was human chains outside this university. It's only 2 blocks away from where I live, so I used to see these human chains every day. And then a lot of figures from abroad got involved. They shot, this is appalling, this is the violation of the freedom of the arts. Culture is under threat. Intellectual freedom is under threat. Absolute nonsense, because the people who were getting involved from abroad, they had absolutely no idea. They don't know the first thing about Hungary. They don't speak the language. Somebody tells them, hey, this really bad guy, Viktor Orban, he's a dictator. He loves Putin, and he's trying to crack down on art and culture. Would you sign this letter of protest? And of course, they will go, oh yeah, let me sign this letter of protest. So they did this, and then went on and on. Now, the reason I bring that up is that there's nothing comparable going on now. They've closed down the MCC. Not a dog bark. There's absolutely no one is protesting. Um, and I think it's because the Hungarian people have sort of been beaten into submission. I think they're not going to put up any kind of a fight. It's much the same as as I said happened to the Serbs. They've been beaten into submission. You just can't expect them to fight back in any way. And what is also striking is that even the leadership of the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, the leadership, who you might think, well, let's mobilize some kind of opposition, let's fight back against the government. They're closing us down after all. We're all going to be out of work. But they're not putting up any kind of a fight either. And to be honest, I didn't really have anything much to do with MCC. My few encounters with them persuaded me that they were very unimpressive. The people there were just really unimpressive, and that they just couldn't hold a candle to their opponents. Their opponents were much harder, much more ruthless, much tougher than they were, and that if the fight which was going to come, it was inevitable there was going to be a serious fight, they wouldn't stand a chance. I mean, they would be just swept aside without any effort. And that's exactly what's happened. So, as I say, when I met these people, they were very unimpressive, and I just, they were kind of enjoying money. They were enjoying the sucking off the teat of the government. That's very nice. We're getting a nice, cushy job, and the government was doling out money, but they didn't really realize that it was going to come to an end. And when he was going to come to an end, there would be repercussions for everybody who was taking part in all this. But anyway, so that's another thing. And then what the Magyar government has done is simply close down public television. Boom, just closed it down. Literally closed down. Today it was simply closed down. No more news on on television. Just it's closed down. All the channels that used to present news. No, it's been closed down because they were associated with the Orban government. So let's go over what was now. You can see on the television screens in Hungary. Here you have. Let me just. It's a little hard to see. This is now you switch it on, and that's the notice that you get on this on public television, and the translation here is the public media must not lie. We apologize for having done so for years. We apologize for having lied to you for years. That's nice. Public media is being transformed to ensure it's independent and trustworthy in future. News broadcasting has been temporarily suspended. Please stay with us. So that's nice. And then Magyar Péter sent out this tweet. He says, "A historic day. Today, propaganda broadcasting on Hungary's public media has finally come to an end. They lied by night, they lied by day, they lied on every channel." And then he sent another tweet in which he says, 70 years after the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, symbolically at 1956, public television channel M1 returns. For now, it will broadcast only films without news programming. So this is very, very interesting because, of course, that's it. Basically no more news programs, and then it's going to come back on October the 23rd of this year, and we're supposed to believe that news programming that will return will be really serious, really independent news. Yeah, there'll be opposition voices. There'll be, Fidesz people will appear. The people who criticizing the government, criticizing Magyar will appear. Yeah, right. But nonetheless, the amazing thing is they just simply closed it down. You would have thought, well, you could take it over. You could bring some people of your own in, but nonetheless maintain news programming. But no news programming for you for the next it's 3.5 months. Um, and of course, the Western media are of course giddy with excitement in all of this. Here is news media, Euro News, that says public media cannot lie. Hungary pulls plug on state broadcaster in post-Orban purge. And then Hungary's public broadcaster went off air on Tuesday, replaced by an on screen apology after Peter Magyar's new government installed interim management and sacked staff accused of pro Orban bias. Broadcasts on Hungary's national television and radio channels stopped on Tuesday afternoon after a temporary management team was installed. Shutting down the service had long been a promise of Prime Minister Peter Magyar, and then it says the channel about they talk about the apology, and then on Monday the temporary management team was appointed to oversee the transition to a new structure. Several managers and journalists were dismissed with immediate effect, and Hungarian media reports say staff were escorted from the building by security guards. Now, this is all very interesting because you're escorting people to the exits by security guards. Their only crime is that they hold that you don't like their politics. I mean, they're being escorted out, just like this the president Tomáš Súlyog, who's now going to be the subject of this constitutional amendment to remove him from office. They can't impeach him because he hasn't done anything wrong. I mean, if you impeach someone, you actually have to make a case that he has in some way, um, violated his oath of office. So they can't prove that he's fulfilled his duties as he's supposed to. So they can't impeach him for anything. So they just simply pass a constitutional amendment. They have a majority, they can pass the constitutional amendment and just throw him out of power. So all of this is fundamentally complete anathema to anything that we understand by democracy. It's a absolute onslaught on democracy, and the media and of course Brussels are absolutely delighted by it. Now, by now, we should be used to this kind of thing because it's become the norm throughout Europe. I remember when in Romania they just simply canceled the election. I mean, the voting had already started. They canceled the election because it was going to result in the wrong outcome. So in this case, here is Magyar. He's closing down an educational institution. Boom, that's it. The whole thing's just been closed down. Then he closes down public television. And so apparently all you need to say is, oh, this was all Orban, Orban, and that's enough. And oh, great. Well, of course it was all Orban. It was, and that's good. Yeah, you want to close down because they're all Orban. So when people say, this all is reminiscent of the worst days of the communists in Hungary in the late 1940s and early 1950s, then it's not exactly hyperbole because that's kind of what it was about. You were just closed down. He says, we just don't like your politics, so we're just closing it down. And this is where, Europe is now heading. This is I think this is going to be in country after country. You kind of impose these kinds of liberal, I suppose, if you want to call them liberal, these kind of dictatorships in which you remove anyone who challenges liberal orthodoxy. And that was the case really with what Orban, when Orban took huge risks. I mean, you know, even when he was doing this, when he was building this alternative institutional structures to liberal orthodoxy, then you knew, hey, you're taking your life in your hands. There's going to be huge resistance to this. They are going to come after you. They don't appreciate your kind of creating your own illiberal. You know, there was a illiberal institutions. They're going to come after you. And that's why, as I said, these clowns at MCC, the people that I dealt with, you know, I just knew that they have no understanding of what was really happening, and of the intense resistance that they were likely to provoke from Brussels and the various minions and all the Sorosites and all these creatures who were really, you know, gathering together and organizing themselves in order to oust Orban, and oust him and remove all trace of Orbanism. It's not enough just to defeat him. You have to remove all trace of Orbanism. And of course, that's why the media are naturally very happy about all of this. And here we have MTVA has faced years of criticism under the Orban government, with opposition parties and international organizations accusing it of biased coverage, while Magyar accused it of spreading disinformation during this year's election campaign. Now, remember, Magyar made a whole bunch of allegations during this campaign, not one of which has ever been proven to be correct. Yeah, I mean, you know, remember he said, I covered it here on the live stream. Remember when he alleged that Orban was going to release some kind of a sex and drug tape in order to essentially destroy him during the election. It never happened. And I knew, and I said that this is obviously a lie, in order to elicit sympathy for him among the electorate, to say, oh, I'm about to be the victim of a horrific smear campaign. And of course, he never was the victim of any kind of a smear campaign. But by essentially, he gets a freebie of enjoying the sympathy without any real reason for it. No evidence that there was ever going to be the release of some sex and drug tape. The same with all his allegations about, oh, this pedophilia in Fidesz and so on. He hasn't produced any evidence. There's no evidence whatever there's any kind of pedophilia or pedophiles ring in Fidesz. But again, he gets uncritical media coverage. He gets to throw around these accusations. And most of the time, if you look at his tweets, and especially his Facebook posts, he's all the time just attacking Fidesz, attacking Orban. That's all he does. So, which is quite an extraordinary. He's just won an election, major win, but instead of governing, he's going after Orban and Fidesz. And why is he doing that? Because those are his instructions. He was told by Brussels that that's your main task. You know, if you want money from us, you need to go after Orban. And that's all he does. There's no governance. You know, he's not putting forward, well, here is our healthcare plan. And remember, he's got a huge majority. He can put forward any kind of healthcare plan he wants. This is our education plan. No, his only plans are to go after his opponents. Now, so let's go on here with the Euronews. And then, of course, the OSCE found that MTVA's coverage had been systematically skewed with newspapers. I mean, the problem is OSCE is now so discredited that you can't believe anything in any of their claims. Of course, they were going to say that. Anyway, in The Guardian, of course, also very gleeful. The Hungarian public media outlets halt broadcasting in post-Orban shakeup. And Peter Magyar hails and the propaganda broadcasts as Kossuth Radio and M1 TV channels suspend transmission, which is very interesting because Kossuth Radio essentially plays classical music, but that's all be suspended. So Peter Magyar hails end of propaganda broadcasts. He apparently is going to present us with broadcasts that are not propaganda. You can see he really believes in freedom of speech and democracy. I mean, he's obviously, you can just tell by looking at him. Anyway, it says Hungarian public media outlets close to Viktor Orban have suspended broadcasting, the country's prime minister said, as he hailed efforts to dismantle the long-time nationalist leader's control over information. Notice how the Guardian essentially serves as a public relations arm of Magyar. First of all, he says have suspended. They haven't suspended. They've been shut down. Peter Magyar has shut down these public media outlets. They didn't just suspend doing something. They were shut down. And then dismantle the longtime nationalist leader control over information. Peter Magyar, who ousted Orban in a landslide victory, said a historic day, and then so on. So we looked at that. Tight grip on the media was a central pillar of Orban's 16-year rule, during which he transformed the Central European country into a self-styled illiberal democracy, pitting it against EU norms. Now, the media in Hungary is, of course, very varied. Most of the newspapers are actually opposed to Viktor Orban. And even when you look at the public television, the idea of calling it propaganda, but it's also laughable because the people who claim that this is all propaganda don't speak any Hungarian. How would you know it's propaganda if you don't speak Hungarian, if you don't understand what they're saying? How can you call it propaganda? This is a fairly obvious point, but then you see, this is the point about these news media coverage. Everyone just regurgitates something, but none of them has actually listened. Have you actually watched a news show on television so you can actually ascertain that it's propaganda? Well, for that you would have to know some Hungarian. I mean, that's a tough one. But it doesn't really matter. Just say it. I mean, it's probably true. I mean, let's say, well, it's bound to be true. And even if it isn't true, we'll say it's true. But it's very, very handy to make these kinds of claims. So then this goes on, and it says here that the Kossuth radio station and M1, Hungary's main public television channel, has halted transmission Tuesday afternoon, with the latter, that's the message, and then so on. And then says Kossuth radio's frequencies were broadcasting a Bela Bartok classic music program, and while the websites for M1 and Kossuth were both down. So that was obviously very propagandistic. I mean, you can't very well, you're broadcasting Bela Bartok. I mean, that's very nationalistic to start with. You want to be broadcasting some, rock band from France. I mean, that just shows that, you're in the European mainstream. According to a statement from Hungary's state media, the television will resume broadcasting in the evening without news programs. And then says, another example of Tisza tyranny, Orban posts on social media suggesting that viewers interested in truth should watch the Hír TV channel linked to his Fidesz party instead. And then so on, and then he goes down. Anyway, so then we have just a reminder. Also, Euronews, Hungary could vote to oust president as early as next week. So that's going to be quite quick. That they're going to remove the president. Not through election or anything. They're just going to remove him. Anyway, Hungary's opposition, Fidesz, has called for a demonstration on Thursday after Peter Magyar submitted a constitutional amendment to remove the country's president, Tamás Súlyog, and then so on. And then Magyar's amendment, filed on Saturday, states that the mandate of the incumbent president of the republic shall terminate on the day following the entry into force of the amendment to the fundamental law. You can see that this is all, following strict constitutional norms. The mandate of the incumbent president shall terminate on the day following the entry into force of the amendment. So he's done nothing wrong, but it shall terminate. When we say it terminates, he's actually been elected to that position. He's fulfilling his constitutional responsibilities, but it shall terminate when we say it shall terminate. And then it says here we have the governing Tisza party holds a supermajority in parliament, meaning the amendment is expected to pass. According to sources in the Hungarian parliament, the vote could take place as early as next week. And then the constitutional changes would also remove 4 constitutional judges by setting their retirement age at 70 and limit parliamentary deputies to a 12-year mandate. And President Súlyog has said he has no intention of resigning, describing Magyar's move as a threat to democracy. The question is whether this force will sweep away internationally recognized and required principles of the rule of law, as well as genuine representative democracy, Súlyog said in a statement. And then we have Viktor Orbán. This is Magyar says in June, Viktor Orbán failed the Hungarian people, and Tamás Súlyog, whom he appointed, failed the Hungarian Republic. And then you think, well, isn't that something that should be decided by voters? I mean, again, you won an election. So if you won an election, okay, govern. You've been given a mandate to govern, so govern. But in fact, as I said, he's spending his time waging a war against Orbán, and that's what I mean. It's very important to understand why is he doing that rather than governing, because that's what is required of him by the powerful interests. And then so that was that, and then anyway, so. So here says that the opposition argues that Súlyog was elected in accordance with the constitution and that his removal would amount to personalized legislation. Yeah, I mean, anyway, this is a statement that was issued by Balázs Orbán, who used to be Viktor Orbán's political director. Then there's no relation between them, and he says this is the most brutal form of liberal arbitrariness started in Hungary. The new prime minister submitted his proposal, which would voluntarily replace the president of the republic and put his own puppet in his place. This would put Hungary in a constitutional crisis for many years. The president of the republic declares and signs the laws. So the question arises, what will happen to the validity of the laws signed by an unconstitutional president of the republic? And then the persecution of political opponents continues. And then you will see. Says, and then meanwhile, the prime minister has become one of the most outspoken politicians in the history of the Hungarian parliament. He spends long hours every day on the pulpit, a comparable amount to Fidel Castro was shouting, threatening, and pointing to the opposition benches. These are not the records of the operation of the European state with more than 1,000 years old. We are facing very dark times. And then, and again, he repeats the constitutional crisis. As it says there, after failing to force the president to resign, the government now wants to terminate the president's constitutionally fixed mandate by law. The playbook is the same one as the one used by communists in 1948. And then Here he's talking about the closing down of MCC, shut down 30 locations, send 8,000 students, 500 teachers, fire hundreds of teachers, stop research, demolish institutions, abolish debates, cancel international scholarships, take away dorms, abolish domestic and international camps, pointless destruction and revenge. The sufferers are not the politicians, but young people, parents, teachers. That is ordinary people. What's the point of this? And then here you can see how insipid the response of MCC was, the MCC leadership. And you can see the difference between the MCC people and the people they're up against. Who know how to play the game, who are ruthless, and who play to win. MCC has no idea, and you just read this absolutely insipid, ineffectual, pathetic response from the leadership of MCC. It says, and essentially they say the post published by the former chairman of the NCC Board of Trustees, that is Balázs Orbán, may be misleading. So they want to quickly distance themselves from Balázs Orbán. Our institution feels it is its duty to clarify the facts in order to reassure those most important to us, our students, parents, and staff. The published founding resolution, which provides for the termination of the Public Interest Asset Management Foundation, this is this KEKVA, is not the result of an unexpected government decision, but fits exactly into the schedule set out in the law on MCC. In the spirit of the law, the exerciser of founding rights was obliged to take action to terminate the TEC form by July the 31st at the latest. So in other words, we're not complaining about any illegalities. That's all fine. As the next step in the process, the government will also make a decision to terminate KEKVA, and then the founder's legal practitioner will call on the non-public founder to make a declaration on continued operation, blah, blah, blah. In this procedure, the Tombo family can declare whether they intend to continue operating the MCC. If the founder's intention is to do so, the government will make a decision and revoke the termination decision. We emphasize that no unexpected or extraordinary developments have occurred. The MCC management is currently cooperating constructively with the government and is doing everything possible to ensure that the original founder can continue to operate the institution smoothly and in a different organizational form. So just please don't be mean to us. And it says, we hope that our unique talent development program, our training, our research, and our international scholarships, which involve 8,000 students and 30 locations in the Carpathian Basin, can continue as usual and safely. The future and peace of mind of our students, their parents, and our staff is our number one priority. So, here you can see the total lack of any kind of fight, protest. As I said, just remember the fight that was put up by the supporters of the Central European University. That went on. And they managed to get the international support, huge amount of international support. And then even something that, no one might know about, like the Budapest University of Theatre and Film Arts, got all these actors and directors and all sorts of bureaucrats, cultural bureaucrats weighing in on this horrific persecution of artists in Hungary, when all the Hungarian government has done is said, you should focus a little more on Hungarian culture and do a little bit less of I don't know, the theater of alienation and theater of the absurd, all the other things that you get from Europe. But so no, there's no real fight. is to be expected. This is just going to go through smoothly, just that the president is going to be removed smoothly. MCC is going to go. I think, when, if and when, I'm not, we don't know whether M1 is going to return, but, if it does return, this will be a propaganda weapon of TISA and Peter Magyar. So that's the Hungary, and now let me say a little bit. I mean, I'm probably going to say more on Thursday, but let me say a little bit about the NATO and the thrilling development. As you know, there is the summit in Ankara, where Trump has come along and done his familiar routine of complaining about how little the other NATO member states are paying, and he's complaining about how little they helped with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, and he's even brought up Denmark. Is remember the whole thing with Denmark and Greenland. He said, "Hey, why don't you help me on Greenland?" We thought that that's all been forgotten. Remember, he marched into the Davos gathering as going, "This is going to be it. This is the big showdown between America and the Europeans over Greenland." And then it all kind of fizzled out. They said, "We're going to discuss this," and blah 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 blah. So that's now been going on since February, and there doesn't seem to be any real progress on anything on Greenland. So, but Trump does his routine. We're going to do. I've had it. These Europeans really just make me sick, and then Mark Rutte says, "Well, he's Trump is really being very helpful," and the Europeans say, "Well, we got to be helpful," but it is a charade, and it is a charade done for one reason only. This is the Americans want the Europeans to shoulder more of the cost of NATO in Europe. So the Americans can then focus on other things, the Middle East, the Far East, and that the Europeans can, which are, they are wealthy countries, they can, spend more on the European continent, and that's what Trump is doing. And so when the Europeans said, "Well, we that's it, we don't like being bullied by Trump. We are definitely going to spend more on our military. It's very important to have a European component to NATO." Well, that's exactly what Trump wants you to do. That's it. This is all a kind of a Punch and Judy show, the outcome of which is that Europe is going to cough up a lot more money on its military, just as Trump and every other US president has wanted. And then, in theory, the United States can focus on the things that he wants to focus on, which namely the Middle East, but ultimately the Far East and the rise of China and the threat from China. So this whole thing, there's going to be this European dimension. We're going to do all these things that to show that we are really Europeanizing NATO, that we don't need the Americans. Well, that's exactly what Trump wants you to do. Thank you very much. But so we get there via this fake Punch and Judy show. And so we knew exactly Trump's going to go in there, say, "I'm in a really bad mood." He's always done this. He did that during his first term when he brought up the issue of Nord Stream. You remember why are you paying money to Russia for your gas and then expect us to defend you against Russia? He did all that. So that was then, again, another Punch and Judy show. And now we got a new Punch and Judy show, Greenland, Iran, the Strait of Hormuz. and of course, hey, you got to pay up. Um, Now, a couple of interesting developments in at this summit. So, going in, Mark Rutte held a news conference, and during this news conference, he said that he wasn't really very sure what was going to get Putin to the negotiating table. Now, you might not really notice such a banal comment. However, it undercuts what has been NATO's strategy since 2022, namely that, well, if we keep delivering arms to Ukraine, and we did, when we provide them with lots and lots of money, and we provide them with intelligence and artillery and everything, and we direct them to hit targets inside Russia, that's going to bring Putin to the negotiating table. Apparently, if once Putin realizes that this war is really hurting him, then that's going to bring him to the negotiating table. I mean, it was always very dubious because we've had sanction package after sanctions package. We've had, I don't know how many billions. No one can keep tabs on how many billions have poured into Ukraine, arms, and God knows, and there's been obviously targeting of targets inside Russia, thanks to American satellite intelligence. All of that hasn't shifted Russia one bit. You can certainly criticize the way the Russians have been fighting this war, the fact that it's dragged on for so long, but it hasn't shifted Russia's objectives. Russia has said, Putin obviously outlined his goals in, obviously he outlined the goals at the beginning in February 24th, 2022. Then he outlined them after the incorporation of Kherson and Zaporozhye inside Russia. Then, of course, he outlined them again in his June 2024 address to the Russian Foreign Ministry. And then he outlined them again, and we covered this in the Gaggle on Monday. He outlined them again during his meeting with his general staff, in which he said, well, we're going to incorporate all the 4 oblasts, and we're going to secure additional security zones or buffer zones inside Ukraine, namely the Sumy Oblast and, of course, Kharkov. So there'll be additional territory in Ukraine that we're going to take. So these tactics, if we up the ante, if we just provide Ukraine with more and more, it will force Putin to the negotiating table. Well, that obviously hasn't happened. Absolutely hasn't happened, and therefore it's a dud, ridiculous strategy. Now, yes, Russia has suffered heavy casualties, and of course, Russia has suffered economic damage as a result of these targeting of refineries and oil storage depots. That certainly has happened, but it hasn't changed Russia's war objectives, and Russia has insisted on the same goals pretty consistently. So that, therefore the NATO strategy is always dubious. And now we have Mark Rutte, who declares here, he blurts out that he has no idea what's going to force Putin to negotiate. And here it is. This is at his news conference, 6th of July, which is yesterday. And here he is asked, I want to ask you about peace negotiation, how we all know that the Putins stay on his conduction, I don't know what conduction is. Okay. And never change how he wants to be. So will be. I mean, I have no idea what any of that is. This doesn't sound like good English. But my question is, what could make him change his mind? I guess that's him change his mind. And what do you think about news from today when he told Ukraine not attack, only defend yourself? How it's all could be. So obviously, her English leaves a lot to be desired. And then Rutte says, very good question. When it comes to the peace process, obviously you need two to tango. Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is willing to sit down with Putin in whatever format to solve this terrible war. And obviously, so far, Putin has declined to sit down. Now, obviously, so now here's Rutte repeating dishonestly a kind of nonsensical talking point. Oh, he's not willing to sit down with Zelensky. Well, of course, he's not going to sit down with Zelensky until really the last stage of the negotiation process, until at the stage in which there are documents to be signed. That's the way diplomacy works. I mean, you negotiations at a low level, and then it moves up into a middling level, and then it begins the serious talks at maybe the foreign ministerial level, and then finally there's a meeting at the head of government or head of state level. That's the last stage. I mean, everybody knows this. There's no point in rehashing this. And Rutte knows this. So he said, oh, Putin's not willing to negotiate with Zelensky. He's not willing to sit down with Zelensky and have a circus in which Zelensky will be playing to the cameras and to the reporters and so on, and it'll be just become just a clown show for the world media. Well, I mean, of course, the Russians aren't going to agree to that. And Rutte just repeats this nonsense. Oh, Zelensky is willing to meet, but Putin is not willing to meet. There were negotiations taking place up until 2022, and there could still be negotiations taking place, but Zelensky is not prepared to do that. And but other than a one-on-one clown show. But remember, even this one-on-one clown show is simply a latest tack on Zelensky's part. Remember when it was, Ukraine passed this law forbidding any negotiation with Putin. So that was then, again, when it was against Ukraine law to negotiate with Putin. Now he wants a one-on-one meeting. Again, throughout it all, NATO said, yeah, fantastic, yeah. When they adopted this law prohibiting negotiations with Putin, no one in NATO had any objections. No one. Now suddenly, we need negotiations. They just said, no one had any problems, for the obvious reason that there was no negotiation taking place up until 2025, when Trump suddenly said, he came to power and said, we need to bring this to an end. We need to negotiate something. And then suddenly all the European NATO member states pretended that they're in favor of negotiations, even though they obviously had no interest in negotiation, because they endorsed that position on the part of Zelensky and the Ukrainian legislature, which prohibited any negotiations with Putin. Anyway, just to go on, so with what Rutte is saying here, so President Xi is willing to sit down with Putin in whatever format to solve this terrible war, and obviously, so far, Putin has declined to sit down. And I really want to thank again the Americans for breaking the deadlock with Putin, particularly the American president, from almost day one when he comes into office, opening up channels to Putin. They think that's extremely important because he was the only one who could do that, and particularly at that stage of the process. Anyway, the Ukrainians are doing better and better on the battlefield, but in the end, I cannot predict what needs to happen for Putin to come to the negotiating table. So, as I say, this is very, very interesting because up until now, the NATO formula was if we apply more pressure on Putin, then that's going to force him to come to the negotiating table. As I say, it was always a matter of faith, not in any way backed up by any sort of evidence that the way to bring him to the negotiating table is through putting on more pressure. So suddenly he says, I don't know what's going to bring him to the negotiating table. Well, now you tell us. After all this time, you don't know what's going to bring him to the negotiating table. But leave aside also all the talk about they're doing better and better on the battlefield, which is not true. Because if they were doing better and better on the battlefield, then you'd be able to cite some evidence of their doing better and better on the battlefield. What strategic strong points have they seized? What areas have they captured, which suggests that the tide is turning in Ukraine's favor? So, on the contrary, Russia is either has taken Konstantinovka or is close to taking Konstantinovka, and that, of course, becomes a very strategically significant win for Russia, because now they're really hitting that final fortified stronghold of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka. That was always the final prize in Donetsk. And so once you've taken Konstantinovka, then you begin the move on Kramatorsk. So that's a significant move on the part of Russia. What major battlefield victories has Ukraine secured? So it hasn't done so. So Rutte just says this, and again the media repeat this, and then the politicians repeat it, and this is the big propaganda mantra that the battle is turning in Ukraine's favor. You just make stuff up, just make it up, and just simply repeat it. And anyway, he goes on here. Putin to come to the negotiation. I think nobody in this room can predict. It is difficult to look into this guy's mind and head. This guy's mind and head. But what we are seeing is an economy in difficulty, Ukrainians striking deep inside Russia, vital energy infrastructure and defense industrial infrastructure. And of course, Ukraine is doing better and better on the battlefield. And as I said, Putin is willing to sacrifice up to 35,000 of his own men, which is crazy, on the battlefield. And then he says, well, having said that he's willing to do it, let's leave aside those numbers. Let's leave aside that those numbers are accurate. They seem very unlikely to be accurate, but okay, let's. If you want to go with that argument, then that leads to the next obvious point. Well, if he's willing to lose 35,000 men every month, it doesn't sound like he's on the brink of collapse. It doesn't sound like he's willing to come and capitulate to your terms. Let's just say it doesn't sound like it. And he's more or less, you see, Rutte is kind of talking, but essentially he's undercutting his own case. If Russia is willing to sacrifice all of that, then it sounds like they're not going to give up. And of course, that's the point, and they're not going to give up. And there's no evidence of any serious opposition to Putin inside Russia, other than from those who think that Russia is fighting with one hand tied behind its back. In other words, the opposition is coming from those who think that Russia should finish this job as quickly as possible. And let's forget all the humanitarian niceties and let's just get it done. That's the opposition. There's no liberal opposition. There's no opposition that says, we need to bring this thing to an end. We need to go to NATO and said, we're ready to negotiate on NATO's terms. There's no one at all in Russia who is willing to say that. So therefore, Rutte is he's just talking and talking, but he's kind of admitting it during this news conference that, hey, it does, I don't know what's going to bring him to the negotiating table. And if he's willing to sacrifice this much, leave aside whether it's true or not, then, he may not come to the negotiating table. And then here, and then it says, oh, which is crazy on the battlefield. Can you imagine what an impact that has on all those families? So if you're a young guy living in Russia and you contemplate joining the war effort, well, think again, because probably you will be one of the 35,000 this month, next month, the month after. But hey, I don't know what we need to do more to get Putin to the table. And that's right. And of course, Politico picked it up. NATO's Rutte, nobody knows what it would take to get Putin to negotiate. I haven't seen too many others picking up this story, which is really undercutting the whole NATO EU strategy. I mean, it just says, I don't know what's going to get him to the table. And this kind of reminded me a little bit about with Rutte's predecessor. You remember him, Jens Stoltenberg? And we used to have fun with Stoltenberg. He was the one who was, his appointment kept being he's kept getting rescheduled. He was supposed to resign some years earlier, but he never did so, and they couldn't find a replacement, and so they just they kept him on and on, year in, year out. It was like one of the longest serving NATO secretaries general because they couldn't find anyone to replace him. But Stoltenberg had a knack for blurting things out that you're not really supposed to blurt out. Just like Rutte now has blurted this out. People are going to forget. This isn't going to be featured very prominently. This comment by Rutte, you heard it here, so please refer people to the Gaggle. We heard it here that Rutte said in this news conference, I have no idea what's going to bring Putin to the negotiating table. But anyway, so that's Rutte blurting this out. But remember, Stoltenberg had this habit of blurting things out. And one of the things he blurted out back in 2022 was his admission that, in fact, NATO was very heavily involved in Ukraine from 2014 onwards. In other words, contrary to all the claims, NATO was acting defensively and basically supported Ukraine in response to the Russian attack. In fact, here was Stoltenberg said, well, no, actually, we'd been building up Ukraine since 2014. Now, the problem with that admission was that it lent strength to Russia's argument that NATO was basically building Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia, and that of course led to the Russian attack, because essentially Ukraine was becoming a NATO stronghold. So here is Stoltenberg speaking to the European Parliament in 2022. This is the high-level dialogue on climate and security. It's a big, strong point for NATO. NATO, of course, cares a great deal about climate and security. And then here we have the moderator says, and that doesn't worry you. There's a situation where you can see NATO versus the rest of the world. And Stoltenberg says we cannot stop supporting Ukraine because not all countries all over the world support us. Then we had the vote at the UN where 141 nations condemned the invasion. We have a responsibility to support Ukraine, partly by providing support, military support, economic support, humanitarian support. NATO allies, here you go. Let's savor these words. NATO allies have supported Ukraine since 2014. We didn't wake up in February 2022. Actually, I've been in Yavoriv and other places in Ukraine where I've seen Canadian, US, UK, and also NATO personnel training, helping equipping Ukrainian armed forces. This is 2014. From 2014 on, I've seen Canadian, US, UK, and NATO personnel training, helping equipping the Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainian armed forces are much better equipped, much better trained, much larger, much better commanded in 2022 than in 2014. So we've been very actively involved with Ukraine. And it says, not least because of the support, the training, the equipment they have received for many years from the NATO allied countries. So it wasn't unprovoked. It's first and foremost the bravery and courage of Ukrainians that have enabled them to stand up against the brutal Russian invasion, but the support they have achieved from 2014 and onwards has, of course, also been key. Now our responsibility is to step up, to do more, and be ready to stand up for the long haul, not because this may last. Okay, so thank you. That's very nice of you to admit after all the years of saying this is unprovoked, that this attack came completely out of the blue. So you've been there since 2014, helping to build up Ukraine's armed forces. And how did you think the Russians would react to this? NATO building up Ukrainian forces from 2014 on. This very heavy fortifications that Russia is now finally attacking, which is the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka, all of this that NATO has been building up since 2014. So that was one blurting out from a NATO Secretary General. And then Stoltenberg blurted something else out in 2023. And here he is this is before the European Parliament's Committee on Foreign Affairs, the Subcommittee on Security, blah, blah. So this is 7th of September, 2023. And he says, well, first of all, Sweden, first of all, it's historic that now Finland is a member of the alliance. And we have to remember the background. The background was that President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021 and actually sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us and was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. But notice what he said here. You could have prevented this attack if you had actually negotiated this draft treaty that NATO wanted you to sign. And what was in this draft treaty? To promise no more NATO enlargement. Yeah, that was it. That was the treaty. That was the treaties that Putin presented in December 2021 and asked for no NATO enlargement. So this attack, all these Michael McFaul and all the rest of them keep saying, Putin attacked Ukraine because Ukraine's a democracy, blah, 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 blah. Stoltenberg, who was the NATO Secretary General, so he saw this draft treaty, and we talked about it. We've had I don't know how many gaggles on that draft treaty. He saw this and said no more NATO enlargement. And how did NATO and the US president respond to that? They didn't even bother to negotiate. They didn't even respond. That was their response. They didn't even do it. But but it was specifically no more NATO enlargement, and particularly no NATO enlargement in Ukraine. Oh, we turned him down, and that's why we got a war. Okay, thank you for admitting it. That's what we want. War. That was a sequence of events. And And there was a precondition on it. Of course, we didn't sign that. And then he says the opposite happened. He wanted us to sign that promise never to enlarge NATO. He wanted us to remove our military infrastructure in all allies that have joined since 1997. Incidentally, that was supposed to be part of the partnership agreement. I've forgotten the exact title of that. The 1997 NATO Russia. I can't remember the exact partnership agreement or whatever it was. There was that NATO pledged in that 1997 agreement that they wouldn't put down permanent NATO infrastructure in the newly inducted states of Eastern Europe, the states that used to be the Soviet Union's allies. So in other words, I would say there would be no permanent military infrastructure in those in those states. So Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and so on. And then, of course, there was wave after wave of NATO expansion. But NATO pledged in that 1997 agreement that there be no permanent installation of military infrastructure. So I guess that promise didn't take. And so he wanted us to sign that promise never to enlarge NATO. He wanted us to remove our military infrastructure in all allies that have joined since 1997, meaning half of NATO. All the Central and Eastern Europe, we should remove from NATO from that part of our alliance, introducing some kind of B or second-class membership. We rejected that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO, close to his borders. He has got the exact opposite. He has got more NATO presence on the eastern part of the alliance, and he has also seen that Finland has already joined the alliance, and Sweden will soon be a full member, and so on. So there it is. There it is. So he admits Putin wanted no NATO enlargement, and we said, well, we'll go ahead with NATO. We'll go ahead. We're going to ignore what you just said. We're not going to negotiate with you. We will have NATO enlargement. And Stoltenberg is quite pleased with himself without fully appreciating the horrific war that he essentially had provoked by this reckless refusal to negotiate what could easily have been negotiated. Something could have been worked out, but instead, basically, they weren't willing to negotiate, and then said, "Oh well, Mr. Putin wanted less NATO. Now he's got more NATO. All right, he's got more NATO. That doesn't mean that you're in any way more secure than you were. In fact, you're kind of more vulnerable than you ever were because, and I will end on this, there will come a point in which Russia is just going to get fed up with this. They will get fed up with essentially co-belligerents supporting Ukraine, and as co-belligerents, they will indeed be hit. And they don't seem to have any appreciation. Well, what are you going to do then? What happens then when Russia decides we're going to start hitting missile and drone factories in Germany? What are you going to do then? What's your plan for in that scenario? They don't have one. They just imagine it can't happen. But of course, it will happen because why should Russia put up with it? You are now a co-belligerent, and therefore you are a perfectly legitimate target. Stoltenberg, who seems very pleased with himself, he is basically saying, yeah, we kind of provoked this war, which is going to lead to a destruction of much of Ukraine. We've provoked a war that could lead to attacks on NATO countries, but nonetheless, Mr. Putin wanted less NATO. Now he's got more NATO. Isn't that cute? Anyway, let's now, after that, take a look at our Gaggle locals page, where the Gagglers, the people who support the dogs and what the dogs stand for, the journalism and the high level of integrity that the dogs represent. So they're the people who keep providing them with money, and much appreciate their generosity. And as I always say to those who join me on YouTube and on X and on Rumble, very happy to have you. But I'm not able to answer your questions. I see people ask questions and comment, but I can't answer those questions because there's just too many. So if you want me to answer your questions, if you want me to address your comments and your thoughts, your observations, please join our community, the gaggle.locals.com. It's a great community, got really talented and smart people. I'm always learning from them because they're always making such interesting observations. They're always posting such fascinating stuff. So you won't regret it. Please join the gaggle.locals.com. So here's first question from Danaki, one of our earliest members and one of our most prolific posters. It says, Danaki, if you listen to the charlatan grifters of Xenon Sphere, you'd think Russia is about to destroy NATO and the evil globalists to bring in the good multipolar globalists. Instead, it's Team Europe headed by Kaya Kallas and Ursula going to Ankara, where that great Putin friend Erdogan may even get his paws on some of the F-35s. No, I mean, I think that's a fair point. That there's been these wild statements, Russia's going to do this and Russia's going to do that, and this has all been ludicrously exaggerated. But where I think I would differ a little is saying that there's going to be a point, I think. Who knows? We don't know what goes on. The Russian decision-making process is quite opaque. But there will come a point at which Russia will get fed up with NATO openly waging war against it, openly hitting targets inside Russia, openly killing Russians. And then Russia will just have to make that decision that these are co-belligerents. They're actually fighting a war against us. And therefore, if we don't do anything, then we cease to be any kind of a power at all. We become like, just think of like Saddam Hussein's Iraq. They get attacked, they get bombed, they're not able to do anything in response. Milosevic's Yugoslavia. It gets bombed, it's unable to retaliate. But Iran has shown that it can retaliate. And since Iran has shown that, and Iran has retaliated against powers that were not even as directly involved in the US-Israel attack as, say, Germany and the UK and the Baltic states have been directly involved. So if Iran can attack the UAE and Qatar and Kuwait, who are involved in the attacks, but not directly, but here Germany and the rest of them, they are directly involved. Hence, if Iran can do it, then it's hard to justify to the Russian people that Russia can't do it. So that's why I'm now more coming more to the conclusion, which I didn't a couple of months ago. I'm now coming to the conclusion that Russia will attack a NATO state, and will do so by justifying it, saying you are directly involved in this conflict. The targeting will be quite specific, namely, I think drone factories, missile factories, maybe missile bases, or drone bases, and they will hit them in Germany. I think Germany is the most likely candidate. Um, I think it'll be the most likely candidate simply because Germany was the one that attacked the Soviet Union in 1941. So Germany, therefore, it's the one that is the most painful for the Russians. And in other words, that this we know that June 1941 is a sacred day. Seems to become more and more sacred in Russia every year. And this was an attack, an unprovoked war of annihilation led by Germany. And the Russians thought we solved the German problem once and for all in May 1945. Apparently, we haven't. We hadn't done so. And that's why I think the Russians are likely to be persuaded by the argument that, well, we haven't solved that problem. We thought we solved it in 1945. Germany is as much a problem for us now as it was in the 1930s. Not only that, Germany has never said thank you to us for signing off on the reunification. We, the Soviet Union or the Russians or whatever, we didn't have to agree to that. We were one of the occupying powers. There were 4 allied occupying powers of Germany. It doesn't matter what the British and the French and the Germans decided. It doesn't matter. The Soviet Union was one of the occupying powers. So the Soviet Union had absolutely no obligation whatsoever in following the fall of the Berlin Wall to accept the reunification of Germany. They say we're going to continue the occupation. We don't accept a reunified Germany because we just are not convinced that this reunified Germany will have benign attitude towards us. We've had bad experiences, and lo and behold, that's exactly what has happened. And because Germany never once said thank you for the Soviet Union doing them this favor, when it didn't have to do it, it absolutely did not have to accept reunification. No one could have compelled the Soviet Union in 1990 to accept reunification. Neither the British, the Americans, the French, none of them could have forced the Soviet Union to accept this. So because of that, and because the Germans just simply took it, pocketed it all, and have now, successively pursued policies detrimental to the Russians, then I think that's the one that's the most likely to be targeted by Russia, and that will put everyone on a very interesting situation. Are you going to join Germany, your enemy in World War II, against Russia, your ally in World War II? I mean, they probably will, but it's interesting. What are they going to do in response? It might focus minds, and keep in mind one more thing, which is that the argument that the way to get Putin to the negotiating table is by applying pressure against Russia. The more pressure you apply, military pressure, economic pressure, that's going to force Putin to the negotiating table. Well, that argument cuts both ways. If you want to bring this war to an end with NATO, then it might be attacking NATO territory might focus minds and say, hey, this war is becoming quite dangerous. We're going to get hurt. doing this. We can't rely on Article 5, and the Americans are going to do this and that or the other. They may, but they may not. Maybe we should bring this thing to an end. So the argument, well, if you apply pressure, that's going to bring Putin to the negotiating table, cuts the other way. You apply pressure against NATO, that might force NATO to start negotiating seriously. So that's why I tend to think that maybe um, it we am I oh yeah sorry that so that it cuts the other way, and it might just bring this to an end. So that's why I think that it's a possibility that even a probability that this war will be extended outside of the territory of Ukraine. Because at the moment, it doesn't look like this war is going to come to an end anytime soon. Ukraine's not winning. Of course, that's a given. But there's no reason for this war to just drag on and on and on, and leading to more and more casualties. There may just be a faster way of ending it. Anyway, so that's my view today. Maybe I'll change my mind in a couple of months' time, but that's what I think today. Anyway, thank you so much, Danaki. Thank you for all of your postings. And then Cynthia, of course, one of our most generous contributors, and generous with her time and everything else. And most generous, of course, is with all her cinematic contributions, all her comments on film, because she's, of course, extraordinarily knowledgeable about cinema history, about film production, about every aspect of filmmaking, not just in the United States, but pretty much around the world. I mean, it's like whatever film, whatever genre we screen here at the Gaggle, Cynthia knows a great deal about it. Cynthia is always able to provide us with extraordinarily fascinating information. And so, we feature American films, we feature East European films, and we feature films from Latin America. And there is, Cynthia always able to help us and guide us and provide us with really fascinating information. So thank you so much, Cynthia. This week we're screening the two Escobars, which timed to the World Cup. This is part of a series on international sporting events. So watch the film. It's a kind of interesting documentary, the two Escobars, and as always, enjoy Cynthia's comments as you watch the film. So you'll be able to learn that much more about the film and appreciate all of the nuances in the making of that film. So anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then here is Cynthia's comment regarding the banner reading "Kill Trump, $100 million Iranian bounty." Trump sealed his own fate by using murder as diplomacy and bragging about it. Between ordering hits on foreign leaders, including a botched attempt on Putin, and bleeding everyday citizens dry through his crypto scams, he has weaponized a global pool of enemies. Now he and his family are condemned to spend the rest of their days looking over their shoulders in absolute terror. I agree with you, and I think that that's why it's such a terrible idea to go around assassinating other leaders, leaders of adversary nations. It's because once you do that, then you obviously become a target yourself. And this is a very obvious point. It was pointed out by Clausewitz in his famous work on war. He said, why have states abandoned certain kinds of warfare? And he listed warfare, though they haven't been abandoned altogether. But for instance, hostage taking, or imposing famine on civilians, said, well, they, which hasn't actually, they haven't been abandoned, but he seemed to think they'd been abandoned. He wrote this in the early 18th century. We said the reason they've abandoned, not because they're so humanitarian, people are no more humanitarian today than they ever were, but they abandoned them because they could be done against them. If you do this to your enemies, they're going to do that the same to you. So these are all very unpleasant. You're starving people into submission. Well, that's very, very unpleasant. But that could be done to you. That's why they've abandoned certain forms of warfare. Assassination as a way of warfare has not really been pursued, obviously, because you know, if you can do that to the leader of your adversary, then they're going to do it to you. It's really is a very obvious point, and Israel in particular does this, but the United States has now followed suit, and there's no question. Once you make Supreme Leader Khamenei a target, then there's absolutely no reason why the Iranians cannot make you a target. And but this is the Americans have done this. I mean, they tried to assassinate Muammar Gaddafi in the early days of the 2011 bombing, because again, and they hit his family. So this is an American practice. They've a number of times they tried to assassinate Gaddafi. Reagan tried to do that in 1986. But definitely they tried to assassinate Gaddafi in 2011, killed members of his family during the assassination attempt. If you do that, then there's absolutely no reason why Libya or Iran or anyone else cannot then target an American president. Why not? You become a legitimate target. So it's a bad idea. And even in World War II, there were no serious attempts to assassinate Hitler. That's always the example trotted out. Whoa, yeah, but what about assassinating Hitler? Well, it was a really bad idea. First of all, for the obvious reason that if you try to assassinate Hitler and if you succeed, then of course, why wouldn't they try to assassinate Churchill? Why wouldn't they simply target Downing Street and try to kill Churchill? So an obvious point. But the other reason why assassination isn't such a great idea is that if you get rid of this leader, the next man in may actually be a more effective leader. I mean, it's clear that Khamenei he was relatively moderate. He kind of kept things fairly, reasonable. Very much in the negotiating mode. The people who are now in charge are much more tough-minded and much less reasonable and moderate and eager to negotiating with the United States than Khamenei was. And the same thing could have happened to Hitler. I don't know who exactly would have succeeded had Hitler been assassinated, but it's quite possible that whoever emerged might have been a lot more effective than Hitler and made all sorts of smarter decisions that could have prevented, Germany's catastrophic defeat. So say, it could just blow up in your face. You get rid of this horrible monster, Hitler, which is always the example cited. Yeah, and you're going to get the same thing. You got the Nazi regime led by somebody a lot more effective than Hitler was. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Cynthia then follows up with, while Trump and his inner circle hide behind elite taxpayer-funded guards, history proves that no shield is impenetrable. Just look at the body count of Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs liquidated despite their top-tier private security. As a new breed of American oligarch, Trump is uniquely vulnerable. The taste of raw blood locks a predator into an endless cycle of violence. Trump chose this ruthless path, and the violence he unleashed is bound to boomerang. As I say, I mean, I think that's correct, and you're right. No one, the idea that anyone is secure is ridiculous. Of course, no one is secure. I mean, Trump came really within within a hair's breadth of assassination in September. Was it no July of 2024 at Butler, Pennsylvania. It was very close. So yes, he has more security now than he had then, but he still had security. He was the former president. He was the presumptive nominee of the GOP. So he had pretty reasonable security. He came very close to assassination. So yeah, absolutely. Hitting him in the White House, hitting him in Ankara, that's probably or wherever he goes traveling. Yeah, it's a challenge, but not impossible. And but when he leaves the White House, which will be relatively soon, he is absolutely a sitting duck. So you would have thought this is an obvious point, and Trump should have thought of that before embarking on these assassinations. And of course, he did assassinate General Soleimani. So he has gone down this path, and he does indeed put him into a perilous position. He's happy with assassinations. Well, you're going to get a taste of your own medicine. So absolutely, I agree with you, Cynthia. Thank you so much for that. And then Summer Petros, good to see you again. And Summer Petros, thank you very much for your generosity. And it says Summer Petros asks one word to describe the weather in Europe right now. And here we have. Where is it? Here's a picture. And Varzona. Yeah, that's it's scorching. I think that's a good word. Yeah, it's the weather is where are we? Yeah, it is definitely a scorching weather. Though I have to say, it has cooled down a little bit. And the heat, the 40-degree Celsius, which, as I said, always makes me. I always have to pause and think. So Celsius just doesn't come naturally to me. 40 Celsius, that's 104 Fahrenheit. That is hot. And then, of course, you have to use your air conditioning, and of course, that with energy prices, that's expensive. So. Anyway, Samba Petros then says, George, in view of your knowledge of the Russian language, could you answer a question relating to Russian grammar? Are there adverbs in that language? And then, the adverbs, I ask because I'm reading a book, as I further on, by the Russian author Sholokhov, which is And Quiet Flows of Don. This is not an account of the diplomatic skills of Donald Trump. The Don, of course, refers to the Don River, which flows through the southern Russia. And then, however, there's a river Don in the north of England. It occurs to me that had this book been written by a Yorkshireman, it would be entitled And Quietly Flows the Don, with Lee added so to quiet, but that's it's in Russian it's simply Tihi Don. That's the title. So that's an English translation, And Quiet Flows the Don. But so there are adverbs in Russian. I mean, adverbs are just simply the words you use to modify verbs and adjectives. And so, yes, you do modify verbs and adjectives in Russian. So, that's as opposed to adjectives, which only modify nouns. But the title of the book in Russian is Tihi Don. So it is quiet Don. It's not an adverb, but Tihi, it means quiet Don. But but the translation was, and this, as I said, quiet flows the dawn. So, but the title is just Tihi Dawn. So, anyway, so thank you for that question, Summer Petros. And then Cynthia says, here are several films centered on the dark maritime theme of shadow fleets. Okay, the Sea Wolf, 1941, for a tyrant's downfall. Okay, the Ghost Ship, 1943, for a young officer trapped with a madman. Lifeboat. That's a very interesting film. Lifeboat, very very unusual film. Lifeboat. It's made by Hitchcock, 1944, for a desperate survival struggle. Dangerous Passage for a high seas insurance fraud. 2 years before the mast, 1946, for a merchant ship rebellion. The decks ran red for a murderous multi-million dollar mutiny. And The Last of Sheila for a tense yacht whodunit. The Last of Sheila. I mean, it's very much a 1970s movie. I can't say I liked it very much, but a lot of people do like it, and it may be worth screening simply because it will be an interesting debate. There might be a difference of opinion whether that's a good film or not. I like this. I like this theme. I think it's not a bad theme for our next film poll. I was thinking of something else, but this may be a better idea than I had. So that, yeah, thank you so much for Cynthia. I like this. It's a kind of has an unusual twist to it. So yeah, okay, thank you. It's a great idea for the next film poll. And then Cynthia says, if I had my way, though, I would also add One Way Passage to the list. While it stands out as a unique exception, being a star-crossed tragic pre-code romance rather than a traditional thriller, it belongs here because the male lead is a convicted murderer being escorted to San Quentin. The overarching shadow of doom fits the shadow fleet's concept seamlessly. Well, that's I haven't seen it, but that's an interesting thing. That's what you said about the pre-code is kind of interesting because those films were actually, the pre-code films were quite racy, and one can't say that the code necessarily um, improved improved the quality of the films. I mean, of course, a lot of good films were made after the code, but nonetheless, the pre-code films have largely been forgotten, and that in itself might be a good theme for one of our Gaggle polls, just exclusively focusing on the pre-code era, and some of those quite racy films. You look at them and said, "Wow, they got away with that." So I think that's a very interesting idea. Just having a poll on the pre-code films, but I like your ones about on the theme of the shadow fleet. I think that's a great idea. Thank you for that, Cynthia. And then Robert, always good to see you, Robert. And here says, here in the New York metro area, all eyes are currently on the former Pfizer building at East 42nd Street. Yeah, I remember that giant building right by Grand Central. East 42nd Street near 2nd Avenue. Manhattan is presently in an office tower to residential conversion boom. But in this case, something has gone horribly wrong. The mayor is on the scene. The area is evacuated with fears that the 409-foot tower might soon come crashing down. Is that so? That's interesting. I didn't realize that. I mean, it always looked like, because I was not a huge fan of Pfizer for obvious reason. It always looked like a kind of monstrosity, and but I thought the building was quite solid. Office tower to residential conversion. That seems a tall order. I mean, it's not an easy thing to go from office space to residential apartments. I mean, you got to fit every room out with kitchens and bathrooms and toilets and whatnot and whatnot. So that seems to be quite a substantial investment, to go from office style to residential. So that's interesting. I'm going to look into that. I can't say I know very much about it, but that's really interesting. Thank you for that, Robert. And then um, Aristotle says, Aristotle 1, um, is Orban still visible and still popular? Does he have a successor? Are Hungarians starting to understand that Magyar is a puppet? It was a very, very good question. Um, Orban isn't really visible. Now, he's called for this demonstration outside Alexander Palace for Thursday, so 6 o'clock local time. I imagine he's going to be there, so he'll be present at this gathering. Um, you know, there was an election. He lost the election, so you kind of have to maintain a balance. You sort of you want people still to be talking about you, thinking about you, but you don't want to thrust yourself forward because you lost an election. So it would make sense for any leader in such a situation to hold back and allow the government to essentially, make a mess of things, and then wait for the public to sour on the government. That's the best you can do. If you thrust yourself forward too much, then people say, "Hey, well, you had your shot, you had your innings. You got to let the new guy do what he was elected to do." But I think because Magyar is pursuing this very vindictive, very nasty campaign, not really governing, he's just settling scores, then that could lead to a souring with Magyar. Now that hasn't happened yet. The polls don't show any real souring with Magyar. But a lot depends on really whether people feel that economically they're doing better. If they feel that they're doing better under Magyar than they were during Orban, and because, as I said, Orban was put under a lot of pressure from Brussels. But if they feel that somehow, now that Brussels has opened the taps and they've given him some money to play with, and if people feel, okay, well, we're doing a little bit better than we were, then Magyar will maintain his popularity. If they're not feeling better, if they feel, hey, lot of talk, but not a lot of action, and we're not making more money than we were before, then I think people are going to sour on all this vindictiveness and all this settling of scores. No one particularly likes that. So at the moment, I think we're in a kind of a holding pattern. Going to see whether Magyar can deliver on anything. But Orban is, with this demonstration on Thursday, he is now thrusting himself forward as a leader of the opposition. He's not in parliament, but he is the leader of Fidesz, so he will be effectively the leader of the opposition. So people will be able to rally around him as someone, hey, things were a lot better in the Orban era, and they were, of course, much better. Is there a successor? Well, the most obvious successor was the foreign minister, the former foreign minister, Peter Szijjártó, who was very smart, spoke very good English, very articulate. He always seemed like the most obvious successor to Orban, but he is in, I think, some legal jeopardy, because I think Orban, in his settling of scores, is going to start prosecuting people. I mean, he may well start prosecuting Orban himself, the people around him, or the people who got rich under Orban. But the one who I think who's the most vulnerable is Szijjártó, because I think they could bring charges of treason. really serious charges. Of course, he didn't commit treason. That's all absolute nonsense. But they could try to bring treason charges. And with these judges, there were these kind of political judges, these hacks, who, they political hacks posing as judges. They're as bad in Hungary as they are in Germany and in the UK, and of course in the United States. So you never know. They might just be able to convict Ciarto. Ciarto is keeping a very low profile, and I think he senses that he is the one, I think, who's the most likely to be prosecuted, and prosecuted, I think, on very serious charges. Bullshit charges, of course. We don't even have to discuss that, but nonetheless could have serious consequences for him. So thank you for that, Aristotle. And then Robert says, One Way Passage was one of William Powell's films just before he fell into the role of Nick Charles. Oh, that's interesting. Again, I haven't seen the film, and I always liked William Powell. Um, and I mean, I think the Thin Man films got a little tiresome quite quickly, a little bit too cozy. But I think the first two Thin Man films were good. But yeah, I think William Powell was always it was always a lot of fun. Anyway, I think my time is up. So thank you so much for everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for all of your questions and comments. Thank you above all to those who put money into the till. The dogs are going to be waking up soon. They're going to start complaining. That's their immediate resort. That's what they resort to right away. But I'll have to deal with them best way I know how. But as I say to everybody, if you want to talk to me, if you want me to answer your questions and address your comments, please join our community, thegaggle.locals.com. We'll be back on Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Please join me. Until then, all the best. Good night. See you.